We have a little bit of time now if there's questions for anyone maybe generally related to our assay session or things we would like to discuss together. I guess to start off, one thought we are trying to, determine, we've heard some assays today, some presentations of data, thoughts on, and I was having some offline chats about like dealing with those that we think should be negative based on large history of use and historic data. Um, we sometimes do see responses in these in vitro and new approach method assays. So thoughts about ways of dealing with that, trying to understand the context of, what are we seeing in the in vitro system? Do we expect that maybe we're seeing things, seeing more positives because of things like lack of absorption that we would see in a human or an animal model? So maybe any thoughts on from the audience on ways to deal with maybe responses and negatives that we were not expecting?
Connie, I think one of the biggest things to think about with that is going to be trying to bring it into exposure with some of those negatives.
Hmm.
And, if there's a way to kind of try and figure out how much is a human actually going to be exposed to versus how much is going into the cells, whether you focus it on like some, like when I'm working with complex nicotine samples, we try and focus it in on like one component um, of that mixture to, then relate it back to the human exposure.
Hmm.
And so I think that's one way and I think that'll be important for, interpreting some of these results because, okay, yeah, it's positive, but is it only positive at doses or concentrations that a human is never going to be able to take without having other detrimental effects? Um,
No, that's a really good point, Jessica. Cynthia, I saw you came on
Yeah,
camera.
I just wanted to add to that. I mean, I'm hoping that's what our ADME and IVIBE groups can be working on to help inform and provide the context that's needed to look at that translation from our in vitro to our human. But I also think, yeah, it's going to be about thresholds and looking across the whole suite of assays for each of the endpoints of interest. So I look forward to when we have, a big picture that we can look at.
Hmm. And Catherine, I see your hand up. Catherine, are you there? I can't unmute. Oh no. Let's see. Maybe I can ask you to unmute. While Catherine's trying that, I did see a few other ones come in. Will the slides be available? We're going to ask each of the presenters if they're willing to share the ones that, okay, we can share those. We do also need to stipulate that, the data you see presented today is draft. A lot of times we're still going to work in to analyze it, and there might be some cases where we have to go back and reperform things that were maybe unusual or unexpected, or there's some kind of control issue. So we do ask, always be careful with that and taking the data out of context. And also, just as we've emphasized throughout the meeting, that we're really focused on the assays and how they're performing with these botanicals that are decently well studied, not trying to generate new data on the botanicals. We have a question from Cyril, and this is something we began to start thinking about with the working group leads and the steering committee. But what type of criteria do you expect to apply in selecting or confirming which assays move forward to the next phase of work? Any thresholds of sensitivity or specificity that are in place a priori, or should be able to guide the next step? And this is a really pivotal question, Cyril, because we don't want to, we went through some assay data. We don't want to say, yeah, that kind of looked like it worked. We definitely want to be able to say, like, have a transparent step-by-step way of understanding, what effects were picked up. If they weren't picked up, why? Is it something with the botanical itself? Is it something with the model system? So what we've come up with today, and I'll open it up for leads and steering team members to comment, is what we want to do is to understand the botanicals we've selected. They all have existing information, as we've mentioned, but try and decide in each group, okay, what is our criteria? And so this is an example, but maybe in Gene Talks, it's something that for the 5 or so that we had expected as positive, maybe an assay needs to pick up 3 of them. So we are trying to define those as, data's coming in, but we're not making the decisions yet. We're trying to let each group decide what is the threshold, and then also the piece I was trying to mention about how to handle the negative controls. But I really would like to hear from others and anyone who has sat on those groups and has ideas of ways of that qualifying of the assays. And also start calling on people if there's silence. I mean, I know maybe Stefan Foller, who's been involved in many of these different qualification efforts, which are a different layer than what we're doing exactly. But thoughts for, what does success look like? How do we measure the effects of what we're seeing? And, you know, not just say, yeah, the assay looked okay, but like, what are your thoughts on maybe ways to do it a little more systematically? And I can't see participants anymore, so maybe he even left. Let's do
Either that or no one can unmute.
I mean,
Yeah, it looks like he's
I
not
think
there.
people are still here, Connie.
I-
Yeah, thank you.
just
I can
to
unmute.
to fill some space, talking about these things. I mean, we also talked about in the steering committee and with the data, maybe with the data analysis group, how not all of the positives and all of the negatives are created equal, and that we really need to do a better job of kind of ranking the very positives versus the moderately positive so that we can use that in our comparisons to the in vitro data. So I think that'll be interesting. But again, I mean, I just keep going back to, I think without the IVIVE and the ADME input, we can't make the decisions, because I feel like those are just really intrinsic to, especially in this case where we have complex mixtures and it's not just one component, but it's all of these constituents together. So I think that, I mean, one of the classic examples when people were looking at the in utero in vivo versus in vitro estrogenicity assays was camphorol from ginkgo biloba extract being positive in vitro and always negative in vivo, and that was an absorption issue, but it was very consistent across the board. So I think taking those kinds of things into consideration would be key.
No, I think it's a really elegant point and that kind of thought. And I also don't think it's our purview to like throw out any assays by any means. It's more a matter of, what is the context? Did it pick up the results? If not, why not? We had one conversation in a work group related to C. elegans actually, that one botanical that's thought to act through a voltage gated sodium channel, the model didn't have that. So of course it didn't pick up the response. So that's something to think about, how do we use these assays together as well in a battery? There's very unlikely that it would ever just be one assay, one endpoint. How do we balance that with trying to get the data we need for screening versus having, hundreds and hundreds of assays? So these are conversations we're trying to think about, and both like when the assays are applicable, what to use them for, where they fit into that maybe screening context. And Catherine had some notes on understanding like key events and toxicity pathways to understanding adversity. I appreciate that discussion. Amazingly, we are a little bit ahead of schedule. We do have our last keynote that we're really excited for. In case people we're going to tune on right for the keynote, I don't want to start too early. So I propose, if it's all right with everyone, we take about a 10-minute break and resume at 2 Eastern time.
Sounds good, Connie.
All right, thanks everybody. I'll just put my slide up if those join as we go. And we'll come back right at 2. Thank you all. And thanks for the speakers in that session. That was really excellent.